Oh, sure. Welcome. Settle in for the story of your favorite historian. Just to be clear, the only true part of that title is complaint. What follows isn't quite an incredible adventure, more like a series of events triggered by sheer stubbornness. But since you're all there, all dressed up and with the lights dimmed, let's get to it. You know that moment when you realize you should have learned to say no? Yeah. There I was, once again, walking down my grandmother's basement stairs, the same space kept at a climate-controlled 113 degrees Fahrenheit, smelling of mold and despair, with precarious lighting provided by my grandfather's old flashlight that looks more like an archaeological artifact than a useful piece of equipment. The book? Of course it was there, waiting for me. Temps Deviationum, the unauthorized manual to the worst temporal decisions of my life. And by unauthorized, I mean the only authorization it has is from my own recurring stupidity. And as always, because I'm too lazy to get a real hobby, because I'm morbidly curious, because I'm me. I opened the book. The old pages made that classic B-movie adventure sound, and there it was, another spell, another trip, another chance to get screwed in an era that had neither basic sanitation nor the common sense not to throw trash out the window. I read it. Out loud, of course. Because who needs good judgment when you have a hoodie with holes in it, braces that click every 3 words, and a brain that ignores all the lessons from previous trips? Apparently, me. In tempus pestilentia, ubi umbri saltant et mords regnant, blah, blah, blah. Plague, shadows, death. The usual. The book has the subtlety of an elephant in a china shop. The usual whirlwind began. That pull on my belly button, as if the universe had hooked me with a fish hook. The air started to smell like ozone and old paper. And, for a change, I heard the sound of a laughing goat. I swear. It's the official soundtrack to my poor choices. And God, the transition is never smooth. It's not an elegant fade out. It's a punch to the gut. One moment, I'm in my warm, familiar basement. The next, I'm face first on the ground. A cold, damp, and sticky ground. I open my eyes slowly. The first thing I noticed wasn't the sight, but the smell. Ah, the smell. Imagine a complex mixture. The base is mud and open sewer. Add to that notes of damp firewood smoke, the sour stench of sweat that hasn't been washed in weeks, the smell of farm animals basically living in people's living rooms, and, underneath it all, a sickly sweet aroma. A smell of decomposition. It was as if the air itself was sick. I already knew I hadn't landed in a perfume factory in France. My luck was never that good. I forced my body up, feeling every muscle complain. My jeans and my NASA hoodie were covered in a mud whose composition, frankly, I'd rather not analyze. Around me, the darkness was almost total, broken only by 1 or 2 flickering torches in the distance, which looked more like depressed birthday candles. I was in an alley. The walls were made of warped wood and some kind of wattle and daub, all leaning at an angle that defied gravity and architectural common sense. Calling it architecture, by the way, was a compliment. Okay, Ned, I whispered to myself, the metal of my braces scratching the inside of my cheek. breathe, analyze. Where and, more importantly, when the hell are you? The answer came in the form of a sound. Hurried footsteps on the main street, just beyond my alley. And crying. A low, constant wail that seemed to come from all directions. I peeked, with the caution of someone who doesn't want to become a historical statistic. The scene was a feast for the eyes. If you're a fan of misery, that is. A dirt road that looked more like a river of mud and debris. There were no sidewalks. Sewage ran freely in a central ditch. The houses, if you can call them that, were made of dark wood, with upper floors that jutted out over the street, almost touching, blocking what little light came from the gray, overcast sky. It looked like the whole world had been dipped in a sepia filter of sadness. The people, oh, the people. Emaciated. Wrapped in coarse wool and linen rags, in the dullest colors imaginable, brown, gray, dirt beige. Their faces were masks of fear and exhaustion. A wooden cart passed by, creaking as if in agony. The driver didn't shout, "Bring out your dead," like in the movies. It was worse. It was silent. On the cart, bodies were piled carelessly, covered by a dirty cloth. Pale hands and feet escaped from under the fabric. No one on the street looked. Averting their gaze seemed to be the official sport of the decade. The Black Death, I concluded, a knot forming in my stomach. The book didn't mess around. It had thrown me into the epicenter of a medieval apocalypse. Mid-14th century. Europe. My brain, that treacherous nerd living inside me, started firing off information I'd rather not have. Yersinia pestis. The bacterium transmitted by the black rat flea. 3 forms: bubonic, with the swelling of the lymph nodes; pneumonic, transmitted by coughing and sneezing, almost 100% fatal; and septicemic, which attacked the blood. Judging by the vibe of the place, all 3 were probably having a party. My initial plan, as always, was to find a discreet spot, interact with no one, wait for the book to pull me back, and, if possible, not contract a disease that decimated a third of Europe. A simple, modest plan. But the universe, as usual, had other plans. And they involved giving me a front row seat to another of humanity's brilliant displays of stupidity. I walked, or rather, slid through the mud, trying to stick to the shadows. My goal was to find something that looked like an abandoned barn or stable. A place to hide. But the town, or village, was strangely busy for a place where death seemed to be the main economic activity. People weren't in their homes, quarantined. On the contrary, they were moving in a single direction, like ants marching to somewhere. Curiosity, that character flaw of mine, spoke louder than my survival instinct. I followed the flow. The smell of incense began to mix with the general stench, a pathetic attempt to purify the air. And then I heard it. First, a low hum. Then, voices. A chant. And finally, the unmistakable sound of a gathering crowd. We reached a square. Or whatever passed for a square in this godforsaken place. An open space, more mud, and in the center, a stone fountain that looked like it hadn't spouted water in 50 years. And there, Humanity was in all its splendor. A mass of maybe 200 or 300 people, all looking at one man. He was standing on a wooden crate that looked ready to collapse. He wasn't a nobleman. He was a friar, a preacher. Thin, with sunken eyes shining with a fervor that only ignorance and fear can produce. His habit was filthy, but he gestured with divine authority, his hoarse voice echoing across the square. I snuck behind a wooden pillar on a porch, a perfect vantage point for my private documentary of disasters. I didn't understand the local dialect perfectly. It was a variation of Old German, but anger and fear are universal languages. And the words I did manage to catch were clear enough. Punishment, sin, wrath of God. The basics of the apocalyptic repertoire. God has forsaken us, he shouted, and the crowd murmured in agreement. Our sins rot our souls, and now they rot our flesh. Greed, lust, pride. And God, in his justice, has sent us the great punishment. So far, so expected. The miasma theory, the idea that disease spread through bad air or as divine punishment, was the cutting-edge science of the time. It made sense to them. What didn't make sense was the existence of germs, bacteria, the lack of hygiene as a vector. That was too complex. And of course, since the human brain loves a shortcut faster than I can look for the remote control, it was much easier to blame something, or someone. And that's when his speech changed its tone. But I ask you, the friar boomed, pointing a skeletal finger at the crowd. Is this plague merely the will of God? Or is the hand of man, the hand of the devil, helping to spread the poison? A tense silence fell over the square. I felt a chill. I knew exactly where this was going. My historian's brain had already opened the file medieval antisemitism.docs. And it was a heavy file. Think, he continued, his voice now a conspiratorial hiss. Who among us does not seem to suffer as much? Who lives in their own communities, with their own customs, refusing to share in our faith and our bread? Who deals with money, that root of all evil, while we work the land? The crowd began to stir. Faces that once showed only fear now began to contort with rage. It was an ugly transformation to watch. Pain was metamorphosing into hatred. They don't die in the same numbers, a man from the crowd shouted, and others yelled in agreement. Of course not, the friar replied, triumphant. Because it was them. The murderers of Christ. The servants of Satan. They are the ones who have poisoned our wells. They poisoned our water, our food, our air. They brought the plague to destroy us. And there it was. The bomb had been dropped. The conspiracy theory, the oldest and most effective tool for deflecting blame, was planted. And I was there, watching it live. From my privileged and useless point of view, I knew the terrible irony. In some cases, Jewish communities did indeed have a slightly lower mortality rate. But it wasn't because of any diabolical conspiracy. It was because of their own dietary and hygiene laws. The Talmud, the Jewish holy book, already prescribed washing hands before meals and after using the bathroom, the swift burial of the dead, and a certain level of isolation in their neighborhoods, the ghettos. In a world where hygiene was an alien concept, these practices, without them knowing the microbiological why, offered a small, tiny layer of protection. A protection that, ironically, condemned them. To the terrified medieval mind, the logic was simple: if they are dying less, it's because they are to blame. It was the same twisted logic that fuels conspiracy theories on the internet today. Finding a scapegoat is far more comforting than accepting chaos, randomness, and one's own powerlessness in the face of a catastrophe. And in the 14th century, there was no group more perfect for this role than the Jews. They had already been viewed with suspicion for centuries. They were forbidden from owning land in many parts of Europe, which pushed them into trade and, primarily, usury, lending money at interest, something the Catholic Church forbade for Christians. This made them financially necessary but socially hated. The debtor rarely loves his creditor. They were, in short, the perfect other. Convenient foreigners living in their midst. The preacher continued his hate-mongering, listing supposed proofs. Someone had allegedly seen a Jew near a well at night. Another had found a suspicious powder. It was the fake news of the Middle Ages, spread by word of mouth with the speed of a wildfire. Pope Clement VI, from Avignon, had even issued 2 papal bulls in 1348, declaring the Jews innocent and stating that they were also dying from the plague. But who listens to the Pope when you have a fanatic shouting in front of you? Nobody. The crowd was mesmerized. The energy in the square was electric, dangerous. I saw men picking up wooden sticks. Others sharpened knives on stones. The collective fear had become a collective fury, and it was looking for a target. I felt my stomach turn, not from the disease, but from the scene. I was an observer of time, an accidental tourist. My first rule was not to interfere. And honestly, what could I do? Climb onto the crate and give a lecture on Yersinia pestis and the importance of religious tolerance? I'd be lynched in 30 seconds. Probably mistaken for some kind of heretic or a demon with metal teeth. My heroism has its limits. And those limits are, basically, my own skin. Laziness and cowardice are great advisors in moments like these. My only instinct was to get out of there. To disappear. The friar pointed towards a narrower street leading out of the square. They hide there, in their homes, praying to their false god while our people die. What shall we do, brothers? Shall we leave the poison in our midst? And oh, the crowd roared, a guttural, animalistic sound. We shall purify this city. By fire. In the name of God. And with that, the mob moved. It was no longer a collection of frightened individuals. It was a many-headed monster, a wave of hatred that began to flow in the direction the friar had pointed. Towards the Jewish quarter. I stood paralyzed behind my pillar, my heart hammering against my ribs. I was about to witness a massacre. A pogrom. One of the many that swept across Europe between 1348 and 1351. Strasbourg, Mainz, Cologne, hundreds of Jewish communities were completely annihilated. Burned alive, drowned, slaughtered in the streets. All because of fear, ignorance, and skillfully manipulated hatred. I needed to get out of there. But where to? The crowd was blocking one of the exits from the square. The other streets looked equally dark and threatening. Standing there wasn't an option either. Soon, the violence would spill over. And in an orgy of blind fury, nobody stops to check your religion before hitting you in the head with a torch. Especially if you're wearing a hoodie with a rocket on it and have metal in your teeth. With the sound of the first screams of terror coming from the indicated street, I shrank further into the shadows. I closed my eyes for a second. The smell of smoke grew stronger. But it was no longer the smoke of firewood from hearths. It was the smoke of something burning. Something big. My job was just to observe. To tell the story. But to see history unfold before you, the rawness, the brutality, no book or documentary can prepare you for that. It's a kind of evil you can feel in the air, that clings to your clothes along with the mud. I took a deep breath of the heavy, foul air. I had to move. I had to find a hole to crawl into and wait for that night of horror to pass. My only thought was to survive another educational trip from my cursed book. And as I looked for an escape route, the only thing echoing in my head was the terrible, simple truth of that moment. When people are afraid, the first thing they look for isn't a cure, it's a culprit. And on that day, in that city, I was seeing, firsthand, the terrible price of finding one. Panic has a taste. It's metallic, like blood in your mouth or my braces after a particularly sadistic adjustment from the orthodontist. And mine were screaming. Not the braces, the panic. The human wave, that 200-headed monster of hate, turned the corner and disappeared, taking with it torches and cries of divine justice. The square, for a moment, was almost empty, a vacuum in the midst of the chaos. Behind me, the wooden pillar that hid me seemed like the only solid thing in a world dissolving into madness. I knew I couldn't stay there. Violence has an unpleasant side effect, it overflows. Soon, the purification of the Jewish quarter wouldn't be enough. Fury, once unleashed, needs more fuel. And a red-headed stranger in weird clothes would be akin of gasoline waiting to be found. My brain, operating in emergency mode, scanned the environment. Most of the doors and windows were barred, people hidden in their homes, praying not to be next. But one door, to a tavern or inn, was ajar. Probably, the owner and patrons had either fled to join the party or to hide in the back. It was my best bet. Running in the Middle Ages is not like in the movies. There's no heroic sprint. There's a desperate slide in the mud, trying not to twist an ankle in a hidden pothole or fall face first into something that would surely give me tetanus at the very least. I crossed the longest 20 yards of my life, the sound of my modern sneakers making a strangely muffled squelch on the wet earth. I pushed the heavy wooden door, which groaned in protest, and slipped inside. The smell. Again, the smell. If outside was an open sewer, inside was a sewer with a roof. The air was a mix of spilled cheap ale, smoking grain in the walls, the sweat of dozens of bodies, and something vaguely like vomit. A home away from home. The main room was empty, wooden and pewter mugs overturned on rustic tables, a low fire dying in the hearth. But I wasn't alone. From a dark corner, I heard voices. Low, guttural. It wasn't the local dialect. It sounded more melodic, more fluid, despite the harsh tone. Italian, maybe? Genoese? My pathological curiosity and my instinct not to get stabbed were in conflict. Instinct 1. Instead of announcing my presence, I looked for a better place to hide than just standing in the middle of the room. Next to the fireplace, a crude wooden staircase led down to what I assumed was a cellar or storeroom. Bingo! I went down the steps with the care of a thief, each step a creak that sounded like thunder in the tense silence. The cellar was exactly what I expected: dark, damp, smelling of wet earth and sour wine. Barrels were stacked against the stone walls. I found a little space between two large barrels, a perfect niche of darkness and relative safety. I sat on the cold floor, hugged my knees, and tried to control my breathing. The sound of the voices from upstairs reached me, filtered through the wooden floorboards. They were speaking louder now, probably feeling safe inside the tavern. There were 3 or 4 men. From what I could understand, they weren't from around here. They were merchants, or sailors. They were trapped in the city by the plague, just like everyone else. But their conversation wasn't about the riot happening outside. It was about something worse. It was about how it all began. "I'm telling you, Giacomo, what's happening out there is nothing," a hoarse voice said, heavy with exhaustion. "They blame the Jews. Idiots. If they only knew, if they'd seen Kaffa." The word Kaffa made my historian's brain jolt. Kaffa. The Genoese city in Crimea. The great trading post on the Black Sea. And the stage for one of the most gruesome and important events of the entire Black Death. I leaned in, trying to hear better, forgetting for a moment the immediate danger, the mud on my pants, the cold. I was about to hear a first-hand testimony. "Don't talk about Kaffa, Matteo," said another, younger voice, trembling. "We drink to forget." "Forget?" Matteo laughed, a humorless laugh. "I see it every time I close my eyes. The city, it was the jewel of our empire. The end of the Silk Road. Spices, silk, furs, everything passed through there. It was the gateway to the world. Vibrant, rich, full of life. And the Tartars, the Horde, they wanted it." As he spoke, my brain filled in the blanks. The Golden Horde. The descendants of Genghis Khan who controlled that vast portion of the steppe. The Siege of Kaffa, in 1346. A trade conflict that had escalated. The Mongols, under the command of Yani Beg, laid siege to the city, determined to expel the Italian merchants. But something went wrong for the besiegers. "They surrounded us for months," Matteo continued, his voice low and somber. "We had strong walls. We had supplies. We laughed at them. But then, they started getting sick. A terrible disease. Fever, black swellings in the neck and groin. They died in agony within days. We, inside the city, thanked God. We thought it was our salvation. Their army was disintegrating." He paused, and I could hear the sound of a mug thudding on the table. "But the Khan, he was a devil. A cunning devil. He saw his army dying and, instead of retreating, he decided to share his misfortune. He decided to turn the disease into a weapon." I held my breath. I knew what was coming. the first documented biological warfare in history. An idea so terribly modern, born from an act of medieval desperation. They built giant trebuchets, Matteo whispered. The catapults. At first, we didn't understand. They weren't flinging rocks. They were flinging their own dead. The image he painted with his words was apocalyptic. I could almost see it. The sky over Kaffa. The cries of the defenders on the walls. Confusion turning to horror as they realized what those macabre projectiles were. Infected bodies, swollen and blackened by the plague, being hurled over the walls. Corpses falling in the streets, in the courtyards, contaminating the water sources. An attack not meant to destroy the walls, but to destroy the people inside. It was hell on earth, Matteo said. The smell, the horror of seeing the bodies. And then, the disease began among us. One by one. First a guard, then a whole family. The air inside the city became poison. The streets filled with the dead. There was nowhere left to run. The enemy was no longer outside. It was in our blood, in the air we breathed. He described the desperate escape. How the Genoese ships still in the harbor were packed with refugees. People who, they hoped, were not yet sick. They set sail, leaving the doomed city behind, an open grave. They thought they were escaping death. And there, in my dark and stinking hiding place, I had a moment of terrible clarity. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place with a nauseating snap. Matteo and his companions, they hadn't escaped death. They had taken it with them. Historians to this day debate the exact importance of the siege of Kaffa and the spread of the plague. Many believe the disease was already spreading along other trade routes. But the story of Kaffa is too powerful to be ignored. It encapsulates the truth of the pandemic. Because it wasn't just the human refugees who boarded those ships. In the holds, hidden among the cargo of grain and textiles, were the real passengers, the black rats. And in their fur, the fleas carrying Yersinia pestis. Those ships, like Matteo's, became the floating incubators of the plague. They sailed through the Black Sea, past Constantinople, and into the Mediterranean. One ship reached Messina, Sicily, in October 1347. Others arrived in Genoa and Venice a few months later. Wherever they docked, death disembarked with them. The rats scurried down the mooring ropes and spread into the port cities, and with them, the disease. Europe, with its crowded, dirty cities interconnected by trade routes, was fertile ground. The Black Death didn't just arrive. It was imported. Matteo and his friends were Exhibit A, survivors of an act of biological warfare who had inadvertently helped set their own continent ablaze. And now, here they were, stranded in some nameless town in the heart of Europe, watching the fire they helped spread consume everything, while the locals, in their desperate ignorance, blamed their neighbors. The noise outside seemed to fade, or maybe it just stopped paying attention, absorbed by this revelation. The sheer scale of it was overwhelming. It wasn't just divine punishment. It wasn't just a poison well. It was globalization, in its most primitive and deadly sense. It was the unintended consequences of trade, of war, of simple human movement. A bacterium that started somewhere in Central Asia, hitched a ride on the Silk Road, was weaponized in Crimea, and boarded a ship to Italy. It was a chain of events, a series of falling dominoes, and I was sitting in the middle of the final mess. "They've burned the ghetto," the younger voice said, pulling me from my thoughts. He must have been looking out the window. "You can see the smoke from here." "Let them burn," Matteo growled. "It won't change anything. Death isn't in the ghetto. It's on the ships. It's on the roads. It's in us." His sentence hung in the cellar air, cold and heavy. "It's in us." I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature of the stone floor. That man, the narrator of my private history lesson, wasn't just recounting a memory. He was describing a death sentence. His own, and that of everyone around him. The world outside could be hunting for scapegoats in an orgy of violence and fire. But here, in this dark cellar, I had heard the truth. A much more complex and terrifying truth. A truth about how the world was connected, and how that connection, which brought wealth and silk, could also bring the apocalypse. And I, the lazy, grumpy time traveler, was stuck right in the middle of the knot. I spent what felt like an eternity in that cellar, the smell of sour wine and Matteo's terrifying testimony echoing in my head. The screams outside gave way to a silence that was somehow worse. The silence that follows a catastrophe. Eventually, the voices of the merchants upstairs also fell silent, surrendered to alcohol or sleep. Staying there, however, was not an option. Morning would come, and the tavern owner would return to count his losses. I didn't want to be on the inventory. I climbed the stairs with painful slowness, every muscle in my body protesting the cold and damp. The main room was as before, shrouded in gloom, but the window, once dark, now showed a pale gray. Dawn. The end of the longest night of my life. I opened the door and stepped out. The morning air was cold and heavy with the smell of smoke and wet ashes. The street was deserted. It seemed the entire city was hung over from its own hatred. In the direction the mob had taken, a column of lazy black smoke still rose into the gray sky, a scar on the horizon. The Jewish Quarter. Purified. A shiver ran down my spine at the thought of the word. I started walking, aimlessly, just moving away from the tavern and the square. I needed a place to hide during the day. A place where I could process everything. The scenery was desolate. The doors and windows remained shut, but now the street was dotted with trash. Not the usual trash of debris and sewage, but the wreckage of violence. Pieces of broken wood, stones, a solitary shoe lost in the mud. I turned a corner and the scene changed. Here, the violence of the previous night had not reached. Here, a different kind of horror reigned. The silent, daily horror of the plague itself. And that's when I saw it. The personification of everything I had learned and everything that was to come. A cart. The same one, or one like it, that I saw when I arrived. The death cart. It was stopped in the middle of the narrow street, and two men were working with a disinterested efficiency that only habit can bring. They were the Beckamorti, the gravediggers of the plague. Men who either through immunity or desperation, took on the most dangerous and despised job of all, clearing the city of its dead. They stopped in front of a house that, by local standards, was almost a mansion. It had 2 stories, windows with crude stained glass, and a solid oak door. A woman, dressed in a dark velvet that must have once been expensive, stood in the doorway, her face a mask of silent, tearless grief. The Beckamorty came out of the house carrying a body. It was wrapped in a clean, white linen shroud. From the shape, it was a man, probably her husband. The master of the house. The rich merchant, the local nobleman, who knows? Someone important. They placed the body on the cart with a dull, unceremonious thud. The woman said nothing. She just watched, the wealth around her completely useless. Money could buy velvet and stained glass, but it couldn't buy a defense against the bacterium. Then, the 2 men turned, crossed the street no more than 15 feet wide, and knocked on the door of a hovel. A shack. The walls were wattle and daub, the thatched roof looked ready to collapse. No one answered. One of the men forced the door, which opened with a groan. They went inside. A moment later, they came out with another body. This one was small, maybe a woman or a youth. And there was no linen shroud. It was wrapped in rags, a thin, threadbare blanket. They tossed that body onto the cart, next to the other one. The rich and the poor. The Lord and the servant. The important and the anonymous. There, side by side, on the same filthy cart, both reduced to the same condition, cargo. Merchandise for a common grave. And that's when it hit me. That scene. That raw, brutal image. It was the origin of everything. I was watching the birth of an idea. An idea that would define the art, theology, and psychology of the rest of the century. The danse macabre. The dance of death. My nerd brain started projecting the images in my mind. The famous woodcuts and frescoes that would appear in the following decades. A smiling skeleton, the personification of death, taking the hand of a pope in golden robes. The pope looks shocked, resists, but death pulls him into the dance. Next to him, another skeleton dances with an emperor, snatching the crown from his head. And the dance continues, in a long procession. Death takes the cardinal, the king, the knight in armor, the lady of the court, the fat merchant, the artisan, the peasant with his hoe, and finally, the child and the beggar. No one escapes. All the rungs of the rigid medieval social ladder, which they believed was ordained by God, were dissolved in a single dance step. In their society, hierarchy was everything. It defined who you were, what you ate, where you lived, to whom you owed obedience. It was the backbone of the world. And the plague, with its democratic indifference, broke that backbone. It said, without words, that blue blood and common blood were equally susceptible to Yersinia pestis. That a bishop's blessing protected you no more than a peasant's amulet. This art, the dance of death, wasn't just a morbid fascination with the macabre. It was a desperate attempt to process a trauma that was destroying the very logic of their world. It was a social critique born of horror. A great, universal I told you so. It was a reminder, a memento mori, that in the end, we all dance with the same partner. As I watched the cart begin to move, creaking under its weight, my eyes wandered to the closed doors and windows. I thought of the woman in velvet. For her, the great equalization was a tragedy that robbed her of her status along with her husband. I thought of the inhabitants of the hovel. For them, well, death was a more familiar companion. But maybe there was a kind of dark, bitter comfort in knowing that the plague made no distinctions. That the feudal lord who collected extortionate taxes was trembling with fear in his feather bed, just as they trembled on their straw pallets. In an alley, I saw a wooden top abandoned in the mud. A child's toy. How many children were taken in that dance? Art didn't usually show that very often. It was too grim, even for them. But the reality was there, in the mud. The plague did not spare the little dancers. The social structure was rotting along with the bodies. Fear was the new king. And everyone was his subject. I continued my walk, leaving the cart behind. I found a building that looked like it had been a warehouse, its door broken open. I went up to an upper floor. It was empty, except for a few torn sacks and the smell of rats. But there was a high window, with a crack, that looked out over the city's rooftops. It was the closest to safety I was going to get. I sat on the floor, my back against the cold wall, and looked out. The gray city stretched out under an equally gray sky. Smoke rose from the former ghetto. The silence was heavy. In less than 24 hours, I had witnessed three facets of the same catastrophe. First, the face of human hatred, the search for a scapegoat, the violence of ignorance. Then, the face of war and commerce, the story of how ambition and cruelty turned a disease into a weapon and spread it across the world. And now, the face of philosophy, the terrible epiphany that, in the face of chaos, social order is an illusion. The hatred, the origin, and the consequence. It was a complete and intensive history lesson. And I didn't even have to pay tuition. Just my sanity. Looking at those rooftops, at that sick city, I could only think about how ironic humans are. They spend their whole lives building walls, hierarchies, titles, and castles to separate themselves from one another. And then something you can't see comes along, a bacterium on a rat's fur, and reminds them all, from the Pope to the peasant, that in the end, they are all the same. Frail bodies, waiting for their turn in the dance. And I, the idiot from the future, had a front row seat to the show. Lucky me. My hideout in the abandoned warehouse was a luxury box for the end of the world. It had 4 walls, a roof that only dripped a little, and a rat population that, luckily for me, seemed more interested in the sacks of rotten grain than in me. For now, I spent the next 2 days in this paradise. Time here doesn't pass in hours, it passes in shades of gray. The gray of dawn, the gray of midday, the gray of dusk. The monotony of doom. My window was my news feed. No pop-ups, no clickbait, just a constant stream of high-definition misery. I saw the routines of the plague. The death cart made its circuit twice a day, once in the morning, once at dusk. On the first day, I counted the bodies. On the second, I stopped. The numbers lost their meaning. I saw the people, or what was left of them. An elderly woman, in the house across the street, would open her door every few hours, look towards the end of the alley, wait, and then close the door again. Waiting for a son? A husband? Someone who was taken on the cart and she didn't know it yet? Her hope was almost sadder to see than the dead. The children, when they appeared, were the strangest. A group of 3, no older than 7 or 8, played in the mud. But their game was a macabre version of tag. One of them would fall, pretending to be dead, and the other 2 would have to drag her to the grave, a dark corner of the alley. They would laugh. Children adapt to anything, and that is absolutely terrifying. My laziness and my instinct for self-preservation were in perfect harmony. Stay put. Don't move. Don't breathe too deeply. But biology, that traitor, began to assert itself. Hunger. Thirst. The 2 days of feeding on dust and anxiety were taking their toll. My stomach was rumbling with a violence that I feared might attract the attention of the entire neighborhood. I knew I had to leave. To look for water that didn't look like a cholera soup and something to eat that wasn't being fought over by rats. I waited for twilight, when the shadows were long and the city sank into a deathly stillness. With my heart in my throat and my stomach on the floor, I climbed down from my perch. The street was cold and silent. Every step was a risk assessment. Avoid the central ditch. Don't step on anything that makes a noise. Every dark window looked like an eye watching me. My plan was simple: find a house that looked finished. A house from which the cart had already taken all its occupants. It was a horrible thought, I know. But hunger turns you into an apocalypse opportunist. I found one. The door was ajar, swinging in the wind. A white X had been painted on it, the official sign of property of the plague. Great. It meant the authorities had already been here. I went in. The silence inside was different. Heavy. The air was stale, with the sweetish smell of the disease hanging like a fog. In the main room, simple furniture was overturned. Drawers open. Someone had already looted the place. Great. Looters were a good sign that there was no one left alive to protect their belongings. I went to the kitchen. It was a small, dark room with a cold fireplace. And there, on the table, was my treasure. Half a loaf of bread. Hard as a rock, but it was bread. And a leather water skin, which, when shaken, revealed it contained a little liquid. Water, I hoped. I prayed it was wine. The alcohol would at least kill some germs. As I picked up the bread, I heard a sound from upstairs. A wheeze. A sound of difficult, raspy breathing. I froze. My blood ran cold. The house wasn't empty. My whole body screamed at me to drop everything and run. But hunger made me hesitate. I had the bread in my hand. My bread. In an act of monumental stupidity, I decided I could grab the bread and leave without being noticed. I took the first few steps up the stairs, peeking through a crack. And then I saw a scene that looked like it was straight out of one of my history books. The door to one of the rooms was open. Inside, a figure was lying on a straw bed. And leaning over him was another figure, completely bizarre. It was a man, wrapped from head to toe in a long, waxed leather cloak. He wore leather gloves, leather boots, and a wide-brimmed hat. But the most striking thing was his face. Or the lack of it. In its place was a mask with a long beak, like a grotesque bird, with 2 glass holes for eyes. The plague doctor. I'd seen drawings. Their theory was that the plague was a miasma, a bad air, and the beak of the mask was filled with aromatic herbs, spices, and straw, a primitive filter to purify the air the doctor breathed. The wax leather cloak was to prevent the bad air and bodily fluids from sticking to his clothes. It was the 14th century hazmat suit. And it was almost completely useless against fleas, but they didn't know that. The doctor didn't touch the patient. He prodded him with a long wooden stick, lifting the sheet to inspect. I heard his voice, muffled by the mask. The buboes are already black, and he's bleeding from the mouth. There is nothing to be done. Pray. He turned to leave the room, and I backed down the stairs, my heart beating so hard I could hear it in my ears. I hid back in the kitchen, huddled in the shadows. The doctor came down the stairs, his steps heavy and slow. He stopped in the main room and spoke to a woman I hadn't seen, probably the patient's wife or mother. "Make him comfortable," the doctor said, his voice tired and devoid of any emotion. "And don't let anyone else into the room." The woman sobbed. "But isn't there a cure? A bloodletting? A potion?" The doctor let out a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of the world. "Madam, I have seen this disease in Genoa, when it arrived on the ships from the east. I have seen it in Florence. Now I see it here. It does not care for our potions. The only cure is the will of God." He paused. Or the lack of it. He then left the house, a dark figure disappearing into the gray night. He was the science and medicine of the time, and his conclusion was the same as the fanatic friars: it all came down to God. The difference was that the doctor didn't blame anyone. He was just tired. The woman went back to the room, crying. I had my chance. The bread in my hand felt like it weighed a ton. I should leave. But curiosity, that curse of mine, made me want to see. To see up close. What was this thing that was killing the world? I went up the stairs again, silently. The woman was kneeling by the bed, praying. The man in the bed stirred. He was delirious, muttering nonsense. And I saw it. On his neck, a swelling the size of an egg, a dark purple, almost black color. A bubo. His skin was covered in dark spots, the subcutaneous hemorrhages that gave the disease its name. The Black Death. Our eyes met for a second. His, feverish and unfocused. Mine, wide with horror. In that instant, history ceased to be a concept. It ceased to be a subplot in a script. It ceased to be a collection of facts and theories. It became real. The Black Death was 10 feet away from me. It was in the air I was breathing. The man in the bed wasn't a statistic. He was a person, dying in a horrific way. And I, with all my 21st century knowledge of bacteria, antiseptics, and antibiotics, was just as powerless as the doctor with his bird mask. The fear I felt was different from anything before. It wasn't the fear of mob violence. It was a biological, cellular fear. The fear of an invisible predator. I grabbed my stale bread and my dubious water skin and fled. I ran out of that house as if it were on fire. I ran through the dark streets without caring about the noise, back to the relative safety of my warehouse. I climbed up to my nest, barred the door with a wooden beam, and huddled in the farthest corner. I was shaking uncontrollably. The image of that man, of the bubo, wouldn't leave my head. My sarcasm, my armor of irony, all of it seemed pathetically thin now. I wasn't an observer. I was a potential target. A vulnerable organism. The dance of death wasn't an artistic allegory for me. It was a very real possibility. And, for the first time since I found that stupid book, I didn't just want to go home. I needed to go home. The question was, how? And, more importantly, would I survive until then? Fear has a curious effect. It burns away all other sensations. Hunger, cold, exhaustion, all of it became secondary. My only instinct, the only command my brain could process, was, flee. I was huddled in my warehouse, the stale bread forgotten beside me, and all I could see was that man's face, the feverish eyes, the black bubo on his neck. History was no longer a documentary. It was a predator, and I was in the cage with it. Passive waiting was no longer an option. Wait for the book to magically pull me back? What if it didn't? What if the next person to open the door to this warehouse was death, with his skeletal grin, coming to ask me to dance? No, thank you. I'm a terrible dancer. I had to find the book. It always shows up somewhere. It's the only consistent rule in this chaos. It throws me into the fire and then, just as I'm about to turn to ash, it throws me a rope. I just had to find the damn rope. With a resolution born of pure terror, I stood up. It was time to leave my hideout. This time, not to look for food, but to look for my way out. One last walk through this nightmare. The city, under the faint morning light, looked even more ghostly. The silence was deep, broken only by my own footsteps and the distant cry of a baby. A sound that, in any other context, would be of life, but here, it sounded like a lament. My path was a pilgrimage through the themes of my journey. I passed a small parish church. The door was open. Inside, a single, old, skeletal priest was singing Mass to the empty pews, his voice a faint echo in a vessel of faith that had been emptied. I passed the rich merchant's house I had seen before. Now, the door was broken, wide open. Silks and tapestries were thrown in the muddy street, stained and worthless. The wealth that couldn't save its owner now served no one. And I passed by the smoke and silent ruins of what had been the Jewish quarter. A grim monument to the first lesson I learned here, the ease with which fear turns to hatred. It was as if the city were giving me one last review session. Faith, wealth, reason, all the pillars of their world, and of mine, proving to be as fragile as glass in the face of chaos. But where, in a place like this, would a magical time-traveling book hide? The answer came to me as an intuition, a logic born from the disaster itself. Where is knowledge abandoned? Where do words lose their power? there was a small monastery on the edge of the city. I had seen it from a distance, from my window. Monasteries were the guardians of knowledge, the centers for copying and preserving books. If the plague had reached it, it would have silenced the men, but perhaps not their writings. That's where I went. The monastery doors were open. The inner courtyard was covered with dry leaves and a sepulchral silence. I entered what looked like the scriptorium, the room where monks copied manuscripts. The scene was one of total desolation. Overturned wooden desks, dried ink pots, goose quills scattered on the floor. And books. Precious manuscripts, bound in leather, the work of entire lifetimes, thrown on the floor, some with their pages torn, others molding from the damp. The plague hadn't just killed the monks, it had killed knowledge itself. It had made it all irrelevant. And it was there, in the middle of that dead library, that I saw it. It wasn't glowing or floating. It was on a reading pulpit, covered in a layer of dust and cobwebs, as if it had been there for centuries. But it was him. The dark leather cover, the title in worn letters. Tempus Deviationum. My executioner and my only hope. I walked towards it, my heart beating unevenly. I was afraid to touch it. What if it didn't work? What if it was just a copy, a hallucination? But I had no other choice. I reached out, my fingers trembling, and touched the cover. The sensation was instantaneous. That familiar pull on my belly button. The air around me began to vibrate. The edges of my vision bent, as if I were looking through a glass bottle. The smell of dust and mold was replaced by the smell of ozone and old paper. I looked one last time at the room, at the scattered books, at that world of silence and pain. So long, 14th century, I whispered. And no, it wasn't a pleasure. The sound of the laughing goat filled my ears. Thud. Landing. Hard. Cold. The smell of damp concrete and mothballs. I opened my eyes. I was on the floor of my grandmother's basement. The air was still and hot, but it was the cleanest, most wonderful air I had ever breathed. The only light was from my flashlight, lying beside me. I picked it up and shone it around the room. The crooked shelves, the cardboard boxes, my grandfather's old tools. Everything normal. Everything gloriously, wonderfully normal. The book was on the floor next to me, staring at me. I'm sure that if it had eyes, it would have a smug look. Enjoy the trip, champ, it seemed to ask. Learn your lesson? I mentally replied with a gesture one shouldn't make to a magical artifact, but which gave me immense satisfaction. I lay there for a long time, just feeling the solid, real floor under my back. A floor that didn't try to swallow you with every step. The air didn't smell of death and despair, it smelled of mothballs and dust. The best perfume in the world. The only sound was the low, constant hum of my grandmother's freezer somewhere upstairs. A symphony. I was home. I was safe. I had survived. I stood up, and every muscle in my body screamed in protest, as if I had just run a marathon in the mud. Which, come to think of it, wasn't far from the truth. I felt the familiar metallic taste of my braces, a sensation that had never felt so comforting and good. My brain began to take a mental inventory of urgent needs. Item 1, shower. Industrial grade. With an exfoliating scrub and maybe a blessing with holy water, just to be safe. Item 2, food. I didn't need 10 years of therapy. I needed a pepperoni pizza with a stuffed crust, a bacon cheeseburger, and a liter of soda. Priorities are important. Mental health can wait, hunger cannot. As I climbed the stairs, dragging my tired and filthy body out of the basement, I gave the book one last look and, in an act of pathetic courage, I gave its spine a weak little kick. Never again, I muttered, with the conviction of someone nursing a hangover. It was the same promise I make every Monday about starting at the gym. Both with the same success rate. Because there's no room for deep thoughts about the human condition when your brain is 50% focused on not scratching a suspicious bite that could be anything, and 50% calculating the fastest route to the shower. The duality of good and evil? The fragility of civilization? That's for people who are clean and well-fed. My only profound thought at the moment was about the magnificent engineering of an electric shower. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'm going to perform a sacred ritual of my time, drowning my sorrows in carbohydrates while binge-watching a bad sci-fi series. A series where problems are solved in 45 minutes and no one ever has to worry about the bubonic plague. Good night, everyone. Sleep well. And a piece of advice from an experienced traveler, wash your hands. Believe me, it's a great idea. And if you happen to hear a goat laughing somewhere, ignore it. He's a terrible travel critic. And since we're on the subject of next time, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next time I'm forcibly volunteered for a live-action historical documentary. Admission is free, and all the danger is on me. Until the next mess up.